One of the things that I'm struck with in much of the ethics literature that I read is that there are only a handful of people, Lisa Fontes is one of them, but only a handful of people who talk about diversity in the context of ethical concerns. It tends to be, well, there's diversity concerns and then there's ethical concerns, not that they're merged together. And I actually see self-disclosure as one small component of how cultural diversity elements find their way into having ethical conversations, that it's really always partly an ethical issue. All of our ethics codes, psychologists' ethics codes, speak to the development and maintenance of competencies about basically diversity competencies. There are some challenges in that, to be sure, but all of our codes speak to that. And also speak to a value of justice, that is, not engaging in unfair discrimination. These broad ideas, however, don't give us much to kind of hang our hats on. Because, okay, I'll be fair. Okay, I'll make sure I'm competent. What does that mean to maintain one's competence? I think it's actually a much more challenging process than it may appear. NASW's code has one of the most explicit social justice focuses. And they talk about social workers actively challenging social injustice. Psychologists don't talk about it in that particular fashion. They work towards social change efforts that are focused primarily on issues of poverty, unemployment, discrimination, and other forms of social injustice. Psychologist's Principle D is a justice principle, and we recognize fairness and justice entitle all persons to access to and benefit from contributions and equal quality. And then there's another section on respecting dignity and worth of people, all people, and respecting differences in all different dimensions. And we don't condone acting on the basis of biases, and we try to eliminate them. The Kampf Code has very similar language. Interestingly enough, the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, this is the 2011 revision, in section 1.2, speaks to being aware of and not perpetuating historical social prejudices. It's kind of stronger language than the APA code, at least from my view. The underlying ideas here are fairness or justice and competence. And the idea is that we treat people fairly, not differentially based on status variables. And that our competence is such that we work, and here I'm talking about all of us because you're from one culture, maybe a minority culture in the United States, working with somebody from a different minority culture. There may be some overlap, but there's also going to be difference. So the idea here is being aware of culture, experiences of marginalization and oppression, and how those can powerfully affect our ability to help, and also clients' experience of that help. And that has to do with historical relationships between groups, political, both current and ongoing into the future. So in order to work well, we have to know about history. We have to know about history of our clients as well as our own history. And we have to know about how cultures have smashed up against each other, which times there has been oppression, under what circumstances, as well as the filters and the important aspects of personal experience of those kinds of cultural shifts and interactions. And this is a real challenge because, at least in my view, it's very difficult unless you're a person who is an immigrant or is bicultural in the United States. For example, if you're African American, you, as Dubois talked about, you grow up with dual consciousness in this country of being African American and American. But if you're somebody who's immigrated or you've grown up having a dual identity, there's an advantage and a disadvantage. The disadvantage often is the experience of marginalization. The advantage is really being able to have schooling and understanding from more than one cultural perspective. But for majority folks and professionals, it can be difficult to develop more than one additional view. Scott and Bordowski talk about the fact that really becoming knowledgeable about another culture is enormously challenging because it's so subtle and pervasive. we all live in culture all the time. So being in one means that we tend to just say this is the way reality is. And they suggest competence, really trying to focus competence in one or two other cultures than one's own. And that can be additional to if you're bicultural or tricultural, but at most one or two others. Daryl Sue and his colleagues talk about 6 steps for addressing doing work in a highly diverse environment. And I couch these in terms of the ethical aspects, in terms of justice and competence. And they're really focusing on the competence dimension, but it has, from my view, the ability to increase the likelihood of the fair distribution of services and treatment of people. So there's I think, from what Daryl talked about, some of you may know he used to be a faculty person at CSPP. He's still connected here to some degree, and but he had, a real influence on my thinking about this. And one of the things that he and his colleagues talk about is the importance of becoming aware and accepting difference. There's an anthropologist at UC Berkeley who is Mexican-American and, I believe, East Indian. And she studies Northern European white males in the Scandinavian countries. And she said, well, they've been studying us for all this time. But what she talks about, and this is something that's in much of the literature, is that differences within cultures are often broader than differences between cultures. But that what we tend to do is to, this is kind of hegemonic, but we tend to assume that our culture and our way of viewing things is the way to view things, wherever and however we've grown up. And so one of her arguments is that, and also Daryl and his colleagues' arguments, is that we have to recognize cultural and historical differences in order to begin to understand how they affect here and now, how they affect what happens between us and the person that we're sitting with or the family or the couple we're sitting with. And they can profoundly undermine trust and support and rapport if we're not recognizing those differences. There are, as you all know, radically different views of health, radically different views of illness, how families should communicate, how mental illness gets defined. And in some cultures, there's a value of kind of familial or cultural harmony that takes precedence over personal expression in a very significant way. That will affect how much clients tell us. So being aware of those differences can help us understand through cultural lens some behavior that clients engage in, and certainly we hope our own behavior, in a way that will help remove our behavior from creating difficulty. I don't know, I think perhaps the hardest thing here is self-awareness, right? Because we're all in our own soup. We're all in our own cultures. We've grown up the way we've grown up. We have the families we have. Larry Horowitz, who was one of my professors at Sonoma State many years ago, and a very kind of intense existentialist, said that by a profound existential accident, I'm in this world, who I am, and I'm completely responsible for it, and I had no choice in the matter. And I think that's a really interesting way of viewing it. It's like we are where we are, we are who we are. Can we change behavior? Yes, but we are who we are. And we are responsible for that. Being aware of it is tough because we're in that soup, that cultural soup. And so our definitions of what is a normative family, what normative life goals are, how you think about problems, how I think about problems, those are all crucial. And they vary by culture. Traditional nuclear family definitions of the United States, even in our society where the divorce rates are still around 40 to 50%, the remarriage rates for men are something like 70%. So it's still, kind of this model of a nuclear family, while not quite Ozzie and Harriet, still has that, kind of twin earner, two-parent family idea, but very different models in different families, depending on where families are from and also how long they've been here. So, for example, you might have a Latino family, Mexican-American family, who's just gotten here where extended family is huge or non-existent, depending on their circumstance. Or a Mexican-American family where their families were here before the Treaty of Guadalupe, where they lost all of their land and were basically moved out. They've been here for 10 generations or 8 generations. Right? So understanding how folks compile and think about structures in families and structures in their lives and goals is very influenced by culture, very influenced by how one has developed and one's view given through a cultural lens. One of the pieces, if one becomes a little bit aware of what's going on, is being aware of, as Daryl talks about, the dynamics of difference. And really powerful aspect of that are nonverbal interactions. Most of you know, for example, that in dominant American culture, if I go to shake your hand, and you shake my hand, if I give a handshake like this, what's your impression?
Wimp.
Wimp. Exactly. And then kind of like fish handshake.
Yeah.
Dead fish. Ew. It's visceral. Yeah. It's a cultural belief. So when I had the privilege of working with some Native American clients, those handshakes were a handshake of deference and respect. So my immediate visceral response was wrong. And it was very fortunate that I had good supervision, because my initial response was wimp, or they just don't want to be here and they're disrespecting me. And in fact, it was the opposite. It was the opposite. So looking down, for example, in more traditional Mexican-American families, you look down when you're around somebody who's in authority. It's a sign of respect. The failure to meet somebody's eye is not a sign of, I don't care about you. You know, it's a sign of, I respect what you're saying. You're the person who's the authority in this situation. So interpreting even really subtle kinds of things like that can have profound, or misinterpreting, better put, can have a profound effect on the nature of the relationship, how it develops, and also whether we're able to be competent in providing a service, whether we're going to really understand what the person is communicating to us, which is the fundamental dimension of the work that we do. Knowledge about a client's family and culture. You know, we can get general knowledge and try to understand interactions in cultural context. Literature can be helpful. Art can be helpful. Film, and of course the client, him or herself. So asking when we don't know. And it's not at all uncommon that a person comes in and we may be it, or there are 2 or 3 people and there's no one else on a panel, for example, for managed care, or in our organization who provide services. And maybe I speak Spanish, but I'm not bicultural. Just because I speak Spanish doesn't mean I am sensitive to cultural differences. It means I can communicate linguistically. So I need to ask, what does this mean to you? What's this like for you? What was your history like? What's your experience? Just good clinical skills, but also doing it around potential cultural differences enhances the likelihood that the services will be competent and fair. The people will get what they need, rather than in something that they're not looking for and that they shouldn't have to deal with. The adaptations of skills is really kind of an interesting one. I want to take this in a slightly different direction than the Caldwell, Colburn, and Jenks notion. But most of the models that have been built in the United States for doing psychotherapy, and certainly the empirically based models, are focused on college sophomores. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but they're really about Euro-Caucasian, middle class to upper middle class young people. That's the people who go to the initial trials. That's where they get checked out. Now, they get expanded, and some of them are shown to be really helpful, DBT, for example, but skill adaptation and cultural adaptation turns out to be something that's really just beginning. I mean, we've gotten a number of studies at this point, maybe in the past 8 or 9 years, but it's nowhere near as much as it should be, in my view. And evidence-based practices, you know, the standard is using randomized controlled trials. Talk about good method, right? You're supposed to use randomized controlled trials. I won't go into my rant about the impossibility of an RCT in a human endeavor, but, you know, something that's chemical, yes. Rocks, yes. Interactions with people, no. Can't happen. But until recently, we haven't used RCTs with cross-cultural adaptations of various types of interventions. There are a few and more emerging studies, and a small but interesting meta-analysis that Benish and colleagues did about 2 years ago to test the differential effectiveness of culturally adapted treatments compared with culturally unadapted treatments. And by culturally adapted treatments, they were talking about, for example, using, some of you are familiar with the seeking safety model with people who are substance abusing and also traumatized. And Lisa Najavitz developed it in Boston, it's a very interesting and useful kind of focus on safety for people who've experienced trauma, but where there's also a co-occurring disorder. And it's now been used in many different ways with different populations. Well, in adapting that, one of the things that she suggests is to use culturally consistent language, to use imagery that is culturally consistent. And when you adapt the particular intervention, what Benish et al. Found, and it was not just for seeking safety, it was across about 21, 22 studies, was that there is an effect size increase of over 0.31 or 0.3. That's big. Sometimes our effect sizes don't reach more than about a 0.3. This would double some of the smaller studies. This is a substantial difference. And what they argue, and what I think is true, is that if we work more within the belief system of our clients, we're more likely to be effective. What that means is we have to know what those belief systems are. It also means that we have to understand our clients' illness and wellness myths. I do not intend the term myth to be pejorative. A dominant myth in the United States is that there's a specific cause for a specific disorder. And for example, the DSM, most recent completely apolitical version, the DSM-5, that was intended to be a little stab at humor.
Merck manual.
The Merck manual. There you go, Merck. Yeah. There's right, the pharmaceutical. It's completely unbiased. Okay. It has specific disorders, and the theory is that we have particular treatments for specific disorders. There was some research that Miller cited, and I'm trying to think of who the other common factors person is. I hope I'll remember that. But who Miller cited a year or two ago, where there have been some studies about how much accurate diagnosis, according to the DSM, then the DSM-4 TR, contributed to therapeutic outcomes with clients. Any guesses? 0? Nope, you're too conservative. But you're close, 1%. Now, that includes, presumably, accurate diagnosis of things where you really need to know that a person is bipolar or psychotic and a particular medication would follow. It's staggering in its minuscule nature. It doesn't contribute very much. It's one of the reasons why the feds are moving away from the DSM-4. They're going to recovery-based and also a focus on what it is that seems to work and common factors rather than looking at, you know, what are we going to call somebody.
The feds meaning healthcare?
Yes, feds meaning SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. And they've been talking about that now, and they put out just a couple of years ago clearly that they want to focus on, although they weren't talking specifically about diagnosis, clearly they want to focus on recovery, and they're focusing on what empirically works. Well, these kinds of studies show that if we share and understand a client's illness myth, just like our illness myth, and we adapt interventions, we're more likely to be effective. To me, this is one of those, maybe not a huge statistic, but has a lot of meaning to it. What it suggests is if we're going to be just and we're going to provide services that are effective to clients, that we have a duty to become skilled and knowledgeable about our clients' beliefs. And cultural beliefs in particular, their experiences and beliefs are really critical.
What were you saying about DBT before? That it's a method that...
DBT, if you've not heard of it, it's... oh, you're familiar with it. But it's so what was, in what context?
You referred to DBT when you were talking about...
about, you know, this is an empirically based method, that one would try to adapt that method to fit a particularly, like, to a cultural context. And there may be some interventions in that method that wouldn't really fit, and some that would be perfect fits. So some of the, for example, some of the self-regulatory kind of foci on how do you manage when you have a hot thought or when you have something that's overtaken you, your emotion has overtaken you. The idea of, kind of, they use of clouds scudding by and it will change, and that kind of more radical acceptance. It may fit in one culture and not in another. Okay? It may be more meaningful to some clients than to others. So really thinking that through when we work with and adapt to particular populations or particular clients. The final point, and to me again this is an ethical concern as well as a practical and technical concern, it's a fairness issue, is that we work at reducing our own biases and our own stereotypes. There's an old definition of oppression, racism, that says that oppression or racism is prejudice plus power. That if I'm prejudiced but not having power over someone else, then it's not a good thing, but I do relatively little damage. But if I have power and I'm prejudiced or I'm discriminatory, then I can do damage. And while we don't have a huge amount of power in our roles as mental health professionals, we have some. For example, if you call CPS and you say, now, are you a psychologist?
No.
Okay. MFT. You say, I'm so-and-so, I'm an MFT, and I'm seeing a client in treatment, and they've reported this. There is a much higher likelihood that Child Protective Services will respond to your call with an investigation than if I'm a neighbor and I call. And it has to do with status. You're a licensed professional. Now, you and I have both had experiences of calling and sometimes calling maybe numerous times and not getting a response. Still, statistically, we're going to get a more rapid and a more likely response from Child Protective Services. And I'm not faulting them for that. They're looking at who they think are reliable, but it's status-based. That's how we often judge things. Worldwide, we judge status-based, right? So that's one example of power. Another example of power is if I'm doing, Social Security insurance assessments, or I'm doing assessments for the purposes of bonding for Child Protective Services, my recommendations are likely to have about a 90% follow rate. That is, judges will agree with me about 90% of the time. They do in custody cases. Okay? And so we do carry weight. Power is social influence. There's no absolute power for anyone, actually perhaps the deity, but we do have relatively different social influence. And so if we combine that with our either conscious or unconscious, more likely, biases or discrimination, we can cause harm. And non-intentional discrimination is as pernicious. It's as potentially problematic. So, and I think it's an ethical part of what we do to maintain openness to our own experience, our own defensiveness when we're dealing with issues related to diversity, and looking for opportunities to learn and understand difference, learn and understand the experience, for example, of people with disabilities, who are probably our largest minority group in the United States. Right? Learning about understanding differences within a group of people with disabilities, that there are vastly different experiences. And I think these can increase our effectiveness, maintaining this kind of understanding and trying to work at being aware of and thinking about our own prejudices. And one of the best ways, that was one of the things that Daryl had a conversation one time in one of our trainings. He was saying that for people who are monocultural, and pretty much that's true for me, going and being in a different culture is a dramatic experience to actually spend time and be a fish out of water. Not because it means that I'm sensitive to everybody, but because I have the experience of being the other in a very profound way. And it changes how you view things. So it's one of the ways to begin to get access. It's not a permanent solution.